that.
Well, Merry Christmas, Julian.
Yeah, Merry Christmas to you. So, how was your Christmas?
Christmas was fun. I had all my kids back home, and we usually play a lot of board games as a family over Christmas. It's a great way to just spend a lot of time together and have some fun. So
We do it. We do that too. My mom really likes to get my brothers to have family time. So when Christmas comes around, she gives us a new board game. Then we play that for a couple of weeks. And that gets old. So what did you get for Christmas?
I haven't gotten anything, but that's
Really?
normal. I give
Wow.
my kids stuff, and we also, when my kids were little, we got into the habit of, we usually we have 12 days of Christmas, so we don't do necessarily all the presents at Christmas time. Also, when I lived in Latin America, we had King's Day, which was when gifts are. So we usually kind of have gifts throughout the holidays instead of all focused on one day. And
Okay,
so
interesting.
takes a little relief off of, making sure you had all gifts ready to go by Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. So it's pretty relaxed when it comes to gifts in our family.
Well, it was kind of ridiculous for me this year because I just got an outrageous amount of stuff. Like, they gave me a bookshelf. I ordered me a bunch of books. Actually, some of your recommendations. I got Robert Alter's. What's it called again?
Art of Biblical Narrative.
Yes. I've been listening to who's that guy? Robert? No. My goodness. Just hang on a bit. What the heck is that guy's name? It doesn't come to mind, but he recommended some books too. So I got something from Peter Leithart. Have you heard of Peter Leithart?
Oh yeah. He's a fun thinker, very original guy.
And the guy I'm talking about has been really influenced by Peter Leithart, so maybe you know who he is. He does a daily question and answer on his YouTube. Biblical scholar. He's done a lot of work on male and female gender roles and stuff.
Scott McKnight?
No, it's I keep thinking his name is Robert.
He does a daily question and answer on YouTube.
Yeah, he has a blog called of course I can't remember his blog now either. The tagline is Flotsam and Jetsam. Can't believe you haven't heard of him. Let me check. Whatever. Yeah, and my brother made me a little dumpster, like this big and fully functional.
That's hysterical.
It's pretty cool. It's a miracle. That's right. Yeah, Alistair Roberts is the guy's name. Yeah.
He's from England. He wrote some really good blogs on Peterson, and I like his stuff. He's a sharp guy.
Heck yeah, he sure is. And he had this podcast where he recommended like 10 of his most influential books, and I looked over them, and there was some overlap with what I've heard from other people, so I got some of those.
Well, he's a Calvinist too, you know.
Oh, it's another Cal. Oh boy, you guys are taking over the world, I swear. I swear, everybody is a Calvinist. It's ridiculous.
I think he's a Calvinist because he hangs out with the mere orthodoxy guys, and so he's. I haven't read a lot of his stuff, but everything that I've read from him and heard from him has been really good. So
have you looked into the mere orthodoxy guys at any depth? I've come across them recently, and they seem like fascinating thinkers.
Yeah, they're good. They're good thinkers. They're very conservative. They're deep thinkers, and they're very articulate. They do good work.
I don't know if I'd call them conservative because they sort of seem to be coming from a postmodern perspective. and sort of coming back, and I guess Jonathan Pageau would call it an inversion, coming from the postmodern perspective and kind of calling Orthodox Christianity radical, and then sort of using Orthodox Christianity to critique the modern West is what it seems. Is what seems to be happening.
Yeah. But they're conservative on. See, I think Ryan Anderson. He's one of those. They're conservative on LGBT issues. They're for traditional marriage. I think they're not in favor of women in the. A lot of them are Anglicans. I think they're not in favor of women in the priesthood. So on some of those items, they're conservative, and that's why I tagged them that way. But they're not. They're hardly traditionalists in that they're just repeating traditional things. They are very much doing new work and doing fresh thinking and engaging in public theology.
I guess the only one I've come across is John Milbank, and he doesn't really seem to be much of a concern. But I've also read some of Ryan T. Anderson.
Yep.
Ryan, he's part of the Radical Orthodoxy camp.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Jake Meter, he's in there too. They have the blog Mere Orthodoxy, and then the podcast is based on the blog. But they write, they really do good work in that blog. They write a lot of good stuff. They're deep thinkers and they write well, so they're a good.
Fascinating.
But they are, in terms of, if you look at, with your tradition, you all are kind of over to a side, and in terms of the big battle going on in the church between progressives and traditionalists, they're very much on the traditionalist side.
Oh, there's the same thing going on in the Hutterite camp. Like I have some friends who are we have these colonies, like they're different colonies, and we sort of have these stereotypes about different colonies, and we'll say, oh, this colony is super progressive and this colony is super conservative, and we don't do a lot of we don't exactly have theology scholars, but we do have these little in-colony squabbles going on all the time. But yeah.
That's the way the CRC used to be, till we all became Americans and Canadians.
What does that mean?
It's true. It's an immigration process. You had progressive factions of the CRC with it to the degree that CRC folks could be progressive. Then you had conservative factions of the CRC and lots of different colors of them. No, that's right. And they were all different colony areas, different churches, different classes. Yeah.
The politics are just fascinating.
They are. They're fierce. Nobody fights like siblings. Boy. That is betrayal.
Oh, yeah. And then we have some sort of reform movements within the Hutterite tradition. We have these the sort of group of educated people who have sort of reforms they'd like to push through, and then there's always this dialectic of returning to the roots and maintaining the tradition going on. But I probably fall into the going back to the roots camp. But yeah, so you always have to engage in this negotiation.
Yeah.
And I was reading Peterson's 12 Rules for Life yesterday, and he had this. I'm at chapter 4 now, and I don't know. It's kind of having a hard time getting through it for some reason. I think I've listened to way too much Peterson. If I hear him talk about hierarchies and the proper role of the left and the right and the dispossessed one more time, I'm going to go crazy. I can't stand it anymore. So I'm at chapter 4 now, and that's the best one I've read so far. And he talks about not comparing yourself to other people, because you sort of have your own internal, have your own little things and your own nature essentially. And I was thinking about that in regards to my own tradition and how easy it is to look to other traditions and see how they have this right, and look what we're missing out on, and look what they have that we don't. And I was sort of thinking that maybe it's better if I compare myself to sort of my own tradition in the past, and instead of always looking to other traditions. So
I think that's a wise tact, and again, these groups like, the Hutterites and the Christian Reformed Church. I mean, so what happened in the Christian Reformed Church in the 19th century, liberalism was just running the table in the Netherlands, and these were mostly rural farmers who basically said, we're not going to do it. And so they pulled away from the state church. They had their own little church off to the side, and a great number of those were the immigrants who moved to the United States and then later to Canada. And so you have this, you're exactly like you say, you've always kind of been an enclave because you hived off from the state church, but then you're always kind of looking over the fence at other people, comparing yourself, especially when you're young, comparing to others and wistfully doing. But what you don't recognize is all of the things that you're hiving off and that your high walls have afforded you as a subculture. And so what happened in the Christian Reformed Church after the Second World War is that slowly all the walls came down from most of the communities, and the CRC critiqued its provincialism as legalism, and have increasingly just become Americans and Canadians and lost its distinctiveness.
I mean, when I think of Calvinists, like just from the stereotypes I have, I would find it very difficult to distinguish them from evangelicals. Like, what's essentially the difference? And I mean, Hutterites have traditionally been very sort of this closed off community, and we sort of have this theology of, I guess you could see it as sort of two kingdoms. We have this idea of the kingdom of earth as an actual entity, as a physical entity separate from the secular world, essentially, from secular government. And so we've always had a theology against participating in secular government, and we sort of created our own subculture within the larger culture. And what's happened in the age of the internet and in the age of mass media and whatever is, we've had all of these influences coming in. And so we have Hutterites who are essentially Calvinists, or Hutterites who are essentially Catholics, or well, it's mostly Calvinists. It's mostly the Calvinists taking over the world, really. But you have all of these outside influences coming in, and so what we're always trying to do is to reassert our tradition and try to find out what Hutterite theology actually is. Which is a super difficult thing because Anabaptists, I don't know if this goes for all Anabaptists, but definitely Hutterites, you don't really have much of a theological tradition. You've always been more about living out your faith, living in community, living with others, being pacifist. It's more of a embodying the kingdom type of tradition. So we don't really have the metaphysical theology of Thomas Aquinas or whatever. So,
are your clergy paid?
No. Well, see, that's another key part of our tradition is we sort of have a common pot, or theoretically we do. And we sort of really discourage people from having their own private money. If you go to if you look in the story in, I think it's Acts 2, where everybody's putting their money into the common pot of the community, and these two people leave some behind and try to store it away for a better time. And then Peter finds out, and then they come, and then they actually die. So we actually that's sort of a key text for us, because we sort of believe in having this common pot. You could sort of see it as an act of faith, where you sort of put your trust in the community who's indwelled by the Spirit, essentially. So.
No, and what happens, part of the reason that the Dutch Reformed have such a rich theological tradition was that we had a pretty strong tradition of a priestly class, in a sense. We wouldn't call them priests, the pastors. And so the secessionists in our history, people like Abraham Kuyper and Henry de Kock back in the Netherlands, these were in a sense part of the reformed reformational tradition of kind of scholar pastors as community leaders. And so what that then offers you is a tradition of professional theologians, and
That's,
so then that'll make a difference in the community.
Definitely an asset, because like I said before, in the age of the internet and of mass media, you really need to know what your tradition is about if you want to keep it into a coherent system, because you're getting all of these influences, and you can't really maintain your sense of theological wholeness without being trained in what it is that you actually believe. So
and having the community institutionalize that, one of the things,
right.
So we've had traditionally a strong tradition of strong pastoral support. Pastors are in a sense paid to work on sermons and care for the flock, but it's always so we've had high educational requirements for pastors, but there's always a liberalizing aspect to that too in the tradition, because it's often the pastors who are more progressive or more liberal than the laity, because the pastors are doing all this reading. So then you're reading broadly. So you're also reading and then so it's complicated. It's easy to look at the other system and say, they don't have all the overhead of a priestly class that they're supporting, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time,
on the other hand,
strengths have trade-offs.
Yeah, that's for sure. But again, with the advantage of this priestly class is that you don't just adopt things that are incompatible with your tradition or whatever without serious consideration, or
or maybe you do, and you just have real highfalutin justification for it, which is a lot of how reason and scholarship works. Because as you know, to look at Ian McGilchrist, the right brain is calling the shots, and the left brain is just making up nice rationalizations. So there's a lot of that too. So I'm interested then in terms of you. So you're a welder and you work for a dumpster company, but you're obviously gifted and motivated and interested in scholarship and thinking and philosophy and theology. So what does that look like for you in your life?
Well, one thing I do is while I weld, I listen to a ton of podcasts. So I listen to way too many podcasts, because I've discovered that if you take in too much information, it's impossible to sort of categorize it and find the proper place in your coherent worldview system for it. So you sort of need to cut down a bit and spend more time thinking and writing. And even reading I think reading is different than listening to podcasts, because it's a slow, meticulous exercise, whereas podcasts, you just pump information into your brain, and there's just too much information. And for some reason, you don't seem to have that problem, because you seem to be an information machine of some kind. But then I also try to do lots of reading and writing, and writing not so much, but I do try to find time during my day for when I'm not welding, I guess. But what was also interesting about our tradition is I was listening to a bit of your Christmas sermon, just a bit of the first few seconds, I think, because I didn't have time to listen to the rest. But you were saying that you're having your Christmas sermon on Sunday because Monday is during the week, and you need to have your sermons on Sunday. And I sort of laughed, because the Hutterites are too hardcore to let the day of the week stop them from having their their holidays. We've been having like these 4 consecutive Sundays
That's
where
the way the
we
CRC
just
used to be. No, that's
yeah.
right.
Uh-huh. So
This,
we just
this kind of
yeah.
namby-pamby business about not having services because people won't come and it's a lot of work and you miss out on family. 40, 50 years ago in the CRC, that would not cut it. You're in church on Christmas Eve. You're in church then on Christmas morning. You're in church on New Year's Eve. You're in church on New Year's morning. You're in church on the Sundays, and you're going through the Heidelberg Catechism. You're not doing an Advent calendar. You're not doing special. The special services fall on those days. No, you're exactly right. This is immigration and assimilation happening.
So is that an assimilation into what?
Assimilation into the broader American culture, and then picking up some of the exchanges going on in that culture between religious communities. For, in 50 years ago, for the Christian Reformed Church to be doing Advent and Lent would have been considered Romanish. You're that's papist. You're bowing to the Pope doing those seasons. The Heidelberg Catechism is 52 Lord's Days. In the morning, you have a worship service. In the evening, you have your Heidelberg Catechism sermon. This was standard in the Christian Reformed Church and still is in some of the more rural communities and some of the colonies that are further out. But the closer you are to an urban center, the more educated, usually educated outside of the denomination that the people are. So these things have been changing in the Christian Reformed Church over the last 50, 70 years.
Yeah, it sort of seems like, is that sort of, I was thinking the other day about how sort of you need to create this hierarchy of priorities where if you take seriously the idea that Jesus is Lord, shouldn't sort of your Christianity come before everything else? And it sort of seems like this is sort of giving into consumerism, or we need to have our Christmas holidays with our family, and we need to go to work every day. It sort of seems like the hierarchy is getting skewed in America, essentially, where I guess that's sort of, it's also something Kierkegaard was keen about, was sort of fighting against sort of this nationalism that puts the state over the church, and so there's always that hierarchy.
Well, those fights go all the way. Well, they obviously predate. So of course, you have the early Christian period before Constantine, when the church is kind of below the radar. Then with Constantine, obviously it comes out, and you have this beginning collaboration with state power. Then you have the Roman Empire collapse, and the church is in some ways the institution that preserves the Roman Empire. I mean, if you look at the papacy, all of the language is just brought in from the Roman Empire. And in Northern Europe, you have the Holy Roman Empire, which scholars will say was not Roman, it was not holy, and it was not an empire. But you have this incredible history. And so what happens then, let's say in the Dutch experience, you have the state church. Well, the Dutch rebelled against they gained their independence from Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, and that whole, mishmash, which was Europe. The Dutch, the Anabaptists really launched the Dutch Reformation. So, but then Calvinism was kind of a latecomer, but kind of ran the table and took a big chunk of the population. But in Europe you had these state churches. So the state and the church made a kind of a unified whole. Mm-hmm. But then they come to America, where there is no state church. by constitution. And so these little groups who are often dissenters, like my ancestors, so then they come to the US and they, for the most part, they're able to kind of hide themselves off, and that's tolerated. But then what happened in the CRC is that World War II happens, and all of the young people get drafted off into this bigger world. And they begin to discover that, well, we've got our Dutch Sabbatarianism, we've got all of these separate traditions, but how much different are we from the Missouri Synod Lutherans and the Mennonite Brethren and all of these other groups? And some of what develops then is this neo-evangelicalism, which is kind of this Americanish amalgam of all of these churches that say our distinctives are mostly ethnic. And now, you know, especially in the light of the civil rights movement, we've got real qualms about ethnicity. And so we want to have a new Christendom, and evangelicalism in America becomes the new Christendom. And that really starts seeping then into penetrating these subcultures and leaching the early adopters away from the subcultures, which means that the subcultures get more and more hardened in some ways, because the ones who stay are the ones who are really determined not to change. So then you've got temperamental factors going. So it's a very interesting thing. Now, Canada, you're going to have a slightly different history because you've got so few people and so much land. And I mean, Canada has less population than the state of California.
Yeah.
And an economy about half the size. So you're going to have then different situations in Canada, and then Canada becomes kind of the new frontier. So the Christian Reformed communities in Canada, you have some of the most conservative Christian Reformed communities in Canada and some of the most progressive. And it's a very fluid, dynamic, diverse context. So I'm not surprised by anything you've said about the experience of your community, because it tracks. But see, once you begin to see, oh, wow, our community situation tracks with these Christian Reformed and other people, what kind of abstractions can we learn from it? And then suddenly you've relativized the sacred elements of your community. In the Christian Reformed Church, Sabbath day observance, which was Sunday, that was a really big deal in the CRC. You did not go shopping on Sunday. A lot of people cooked their food on Saturday so the wife wouldn't have to work. You had all of these boundary markers that kept Christian Reformed people Christian Reformed. You didn't marry someone outside of the Christian Reformed Church. You stayed in your tribe. We had schools, only Christian Reformed people in the schools, only Christian Reformed people in the churches. Business, you were kind of out there in the world, but so that was the
that really tracks to the Hutterite experience, because that's basically exactly how we're sort of set up. Like you marry within the Hutterite tradition, you have your Hutterite schools, you have your etc. And again, the business world is probably the exception, where you're sort of reaching out to the secular world and whatever. But yeah, secular world is sort of a weird word to use here, because part of the problem of having these little tribal Christian communities is that it sort of leads to thinking that this is Christianity, and all that's outside is the world, or we use the word the world, and it sort of makes you really, really tribal and sort of really suspicious about other traditions. So there's always that dialectic as well.
Oh, very much, and that's very much CRC history. But it was not only the business that was out there for the CRC, but again, because you have this educated, priestly, scholarly class, they were also out there, and so they're reading broadly. And so you'll have some of them that are reading broadly with an eye to critique and condemning, but then you've got some who are higher in openness that are reading broadly and saying, maybe we should integrate some of these ideas. Maybe they're right about some of these things.
Yeah, it's the order and chaos thing going on there. Yeah, maybe we can bring in one of the things I wanted to talk about here into this conversation. One of the things I've been thinking about is, so I've been listening to a lot of Pageau and Peterson as well. And one thing they've really made me think about is the whole idea of the Protestant Reformation and like their whole emphasis on the wisdom of these traditions that go back all the way back to early Christianity. And what I've really been thinking about is sort of what the Protestant Reformation seems to be sort of this almost thoughtless rejection of all of these traditions, and sort of sowing the seeds of the modern world. You can already see the seeds of the modern world in the Reformation, and I'm really finding myself attracted to Pageau's orthodoxy because of what I can see missing in the Protestant churches. And I'm wondering if you've sort of felt the same thing or struggled with the same sense of missing something because of this. Thinking of, for example, symbolism. There seems to be sort of an awkward relationship with symbolism in Protestantism because sort of the literal reading of the Bible is sort of what's being pushed there, and sort of that's where sort of the modern world gets born out of, because we see the world in world as objects which we can manipulate, and that's how modern science starts to emerge. And there's also obviously the strain of individualism coming up there, where you have the individual and his relationship to God, and this disregarding of the community. So I'm sort of thinking these things through and wondering about that.
I've been thinking a lot about the Protestant Reformation lately too. And so one of the things that, a couple of years ago when we had in 2017, when we had the 500th anniversary of Luther's posting on the Wittenberg door, I was reading a fair amount of Luther and Luther biographies and reformational stuff. Lately, I've picked up again Calvin's Institutes to try to get a better sense of, okay, what was going on in their minds. Calvin's Institutes are a generation later than Luther. Calvin's Institutes are in the 1540s, 50s, and 60s instead of the 15 teens and 20s. And what's helpful about Calvin's Institutes is they didn't have blogs yet, but Calvin's Institutes was kind of a blog. And it was kind of the most popular blog of that time period. And that's really how this Reformed branch of the Reformation really got going, because it was, what happened with Luther was, this terrible fight that sometimes when you watch two people and you just watch this conflict develop, that there are huge forces that have been pent up, and it all comes to play in this conflict. And that's what happens in the initial Reformation. But Luther is the last medieval scholar in some ways. Calvin is already starting to move into the modern world. But Calvin, again, if you read his Institutes and the introduction, which is a letter to the Pope, basically, you can really see someone wrestling with the tradition and the church fathers, because these early reformers knew their church fathers. A big part of our difficulty in assessing the Protestant Reformation is the 17th century, because a lot of the scholasticism in Reformed scholasticism really happens in the 17th century, not the 16th century. And this is where you get this question, is Calvin a Calvinist? Because what you find in the Reformers is that they had, all throughout the Roman world at the time of the Reformation, everyone knew the church was in dire need of reform. There was tremendous corruption in the church. Part of why the neo-sacramentalism, as I'm calling it, is needed and welcome today is the ossification of Protestantism in a way, of this strict literalism, and that's a partner with the literalism is a partner with the secularism. Those two things are joined, and that's too rigid. There's too much order there. But
and,
go ahead.
Sorry, if I can interrupt it. With regard to the literalism, what I see as also tied up with it is sort of a modernist anthropology, where you sort of see the human being as this rational, purely rational animal, and his passions, his desires, and his imaginations need to be sort of brought under the control of the rational mind and completely ignored. So what I see happening with the iconoclasm and with the rejection of artwork and with the rejection of symbolism and this purely literal reading of the Bible is sort of what they're essentially saying is what this human rational animal needs is doctrine and propositions and truth claim statements, but he doesn't, and sort of disregarding the how do I say this, sort of disregarding the symbolic and disregarding the connection to the emotions. And if you look at the medieval definition of rationality, it wasn't sort of the same definition we have today, where it's sort of the dispassionate, objective, monarchical vision human being. It's sort of an integrated life that takes the emotions, the imaginations, the lived existence together with rational thinking into one coherent whole. So somebody who's not living in accordance with his principles is sort of living an irrational life. One who hasn't integrated his emotions in a sufficient way is irrational. So it's sort of an anthropology that takes the full human being. And what I sort of find very attractive about this Roman Catholicism or this orthodoxy is sort of, it seems to have this fuller conception of the human being, and it's sort of engaging all aspects of it in its liturgy and in its doctrine and its practice. So when you're talking about literalism, I also see that in the rejection of in the iconoclasm and whatnot. So how does that sound?
It's important though to remember that that literalism, which again in the 16th century it wasn't really there as much, but that was a reaction to what was perceived as there were issues with the two-speed system of the traditional churches, where you had a priestly class, where you had monks who were praying for the church. And so part of the vision, let's say in Calvin's Geneva and Luther and others, what the Protestant Reformation was, they wanted the whole church to be holy, not just special holy people, nature, grace. All these dichotomies were also in the old system. And so they were really, and then you also had, and what that also afforded with the symbolism was, you had relics all over Europe. I mean, Wittenberg, where Luther's Reformation happened, Luther's patron, Luther's patron was this huge collector of relics. He had one of the biggest relic collections in Europe at the time. So actually, when he backed Luther, he was really going against his economic interests, because those relics were a big moneymaker. And so the Reformation really addressed a lot of the corruption. And so what's interesting about the Reformation is that it only happens in certain areas, and other areas like Italy, France, Spain, it doesn't happen. It's repressed in some ways, but it doesn't take on sufficient popular support. And so there's real questions in terms of, okay, why is that? But then it's important to remember that the Council of Trent, the Protestant Reformation forces the Catholic Church to reform itself in some critical ways. And without the Reformation, there had been many attempts at addressing the corruption before, but what basically the Protestant Reformation really did was force the Catholic Church to get very serious about its corruption. And so it eventually became a blessing to that. But, you know, there's so many layers to this thing that it's very easy now, as we get kind of to the height of secularism, to understand where, we want symbolism again, because again, you've got the order chaos, you know, Peterson's order chaos front going on. So it's interesting because, well, here's the thing, just like the modernists and the fundamentalists, that modern day fundamentalists think we're not modernists at all, we're pushing against them. Well, you've got people you've got folks, regular folks now going from Sam Harris into an Orthodox church. Don't think for a minute they're not taking stuff, isn't getting smuggled in there with them, because they will not be like the Russian immigrant peasant who came over and you and I both know that, because on one hand, we know what it's like to see an immigrant group hive off and take their religion with them. It always changes in the new world, and you might feel really happy to have these, oh, wow, these people are really validating and affirming our religion. Yeah, but they're going to change it too.
Yes, that's something for sure.
And so part of what happened in the Christian Reformed Church, and my father's ministry was a big part of that. So in the American Civil Rights Movement, the Dutch, with their very Dutch, very white, very, if you're not Dutch, you're not much. Well, suddenly, you know, we begin to realize, gosh, we're also kind of racist. So we don't want to be racist. So how can we not be racist? Well, what if black people start coming to our church? Oh, well, that would show we're not racist. And that wasn't the thing that was on top. And then there's discovery, and see, I grew up into that, so that wasn't my experience. To me, that was just normal life. I thought the world was mostly black people because that's what I saw around me. What did I know? I was a kid. But you can see this thing happening. But then, of course, that is going to, well, we've got to give them influence and we've got to give them power. And all of that is right and good. But that's going to change your mix. And there's no place outside of all this change. Even if you put up your high walls, if you double down and decide not to change, well, that move has made you change, because the last generation, where it was naive and implicit and just simply a part of the context, that's different than having the high walls.
We're probably moving towards the sort of change dynamic right now. But I think the previous generations more the high walls kind of deal. But
well, you can't help it. You're listening to podcasts from Reformed people and Jordan Peterson and Orthodox people, and you're listening to Jonathan Pageau and say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I got to think about that. You're the camel's nose there, Julian. You're going to let all these foreign ideas into the Hutterites.
That's true. It's like the whole idea even of icons. I mean, I can understand icons, and like growing up, people would say stuff like, the Roman Catholics worship idols. And I mean, they're sort of if you grow up Protestant, you sort of have to sort of get all of these implicit anti-Roman Catholic biases that aren't actually true, and you sort of have to rethink them as you continue to grow. But
I was in a conservative Protestant church in Southern California, not CRC, but more conservative than the CRC. I won't dox them. But I was listening to the preacher preach about, well, no, he wasn't preaching. He was telling me how the Vietnamese all become Roman Catholic because both the Buddhists and the Catholic worship idols. And so it's like,
okay.
But, so on one hand, I'm not there with you that the statuary is necessarily worshiping idols as in Baal. But on the other hand, it's this element of critique that the Protestant reformers had about the statuary had validity, because they were watching people sacralize certain things, often at the expense of what should have been what they would call true piety.
And yeah, that's another thing to keep in mind is when you and I look back at the history, or when we listen to someone like Jonathan Pageau, what we were actually hearing is sort of this abstract presentation of the ideal of what the doctrine of, say, what are they called again? Say the icons are supposed to be. But what these people were doing back in the Reformation were actually looking at the actual experience, at the actual lived, how people were actually living with these icons and critiquing that. So we're sort of looking at the abstract ideal, and they're looking at the actual physical manifestation. And maybe another example of what you were just saying about this conservative church would be when MacArthur was talking to Shapiro, and he said that where there's an overabundance of symbolism, there's a lack of engagement with reality, or something along those lines. And he was talking about how great it was that the Protestants ushered in the modern world. And what I was sort of thinking there was, is that such a good thing? Because I definitely have my critiques of the modern world. And yeah, unless you have something else to say, I can.
Well, we have our critiques of the modern world, but we sure are happy to step on an airplane or see a modern doctor. You know, you got to give Steven Pinker his due.
But see what I've had this paradox I've been thinking about for over a year now. I was taking this course on Western civilization, and one question that came to mind was, as a Christian, what should my perspective on the West/modernity be? Should I be sort of grateful of all of the benefits it's afforded me, or should I be critical of what it's of all its horrible excesses and all its horrible all of its horrible side effects, and the concrete ways it affects how I think and how I act, and all of the bad things it brings with it. And I always think back to early Christianity and their experience, and the early Christians' experience in Rome. It must have been great to live in probably the most prosperous city in all of the ancient world. They probably had plumbing, and they had their gladiatorial games, and they had their exported food and their perfume and all of the luxuries of modern life. But at the same time, we look back and we see Rome as sort of the paradigm of immorality. So where should you ultimately stand? Should you stand for a position of gratitude or a position of critique?
Yeah.
And sort of the tentative conclusion I've come to is that it's really helpful to think in terms of a two-kingdom theology here, because ultimately, as a Christian, I stand in a separate kingdom, and from this vantage point, I don't actually exist in this kingdom, in this secular kingdom. So I can sort of critique it from my vantage point here, and ultimately have as my ultimate allegiance with Jesus Christ. So that's sort of how I've approached this. And I really wonder about Peterson's whole thing about being grateful to modernity. Yes. So that's what I'm wrestling with.
Yeah. Well, you want to live in LA? LA is Rome, or Washington, D.C., or New York City. I mean, we don't have just one Rome, we have many. And all of those tensions are there. And so part of what, again, in our tradition, you had elements of our tradition that emphasize the antithesis. And what we meant by the antithesis was, two kingdoms opposed. Well, that's right. But then there's also then the place where Paul is to the Jews he's a Jew, to the Greeks he's a Greek, and you have and so then in many ways you have to integrate the unintegratable, because you both need an antithetical. You both need to be able to appreciate the antithetical nature of reality and the integrated nature of reality. And often people, another conceptual framework, I haven't talked about this a lot in my videos, but I've worked with it a lot in the past. A lot of times people set aside, as opposed a center set versus a bounded set group of conceptualization. So center set is more analog because there's nuances and people are following the center. Bounded set has rigid boundary markers. But the truth is that the bounded set and the center set are always working in conjunction with each other, because in many ways the boundary markers are moving. And you'll notice this in your own tradition that very much has bounded set. Well, so-and-so, daughter of the Hutterite community, marries a Mennonite girl. And it's like,
ooh, talk about scandalous.
Yes. But people are like, oh, wait a minute. If she had married a Christian Reformed guy, well, that would just be way out. And Roman Catholic, yeah, but Mennonite, they're still Anabaptist, but there are, but these are the way these things get played out. And then, okay, so then your cousin marries outside the community, and so do we go over for Christmas? Well, they're still our cousin, and then you go over there and you realize, well, yeah, they haven't shown up for all the services, but they're still having devotions or whatever boundary mark you have. And so how hard a line are you going to draw?
Mm-hmm.
My wife's school did Fiddler on the Roof for their 8th grade production. And it was fun watching that, because Fiddler on the Roof, that's going through all of those same issues. The guy has 3 daughters. The first daughter marries a guy within the community, but he has to break his promise to the butcher. The second daughter marries a young Jewish radical who's from the city, and they both go out to the Siberia and live in the gulag. And the third one marries a Russian, and Tevye has to figure out how far will he go. And so the third one, you're dead to us, you're dead to us. But then they're leaving town, and he's like, God be with you. Has to say that at least, because it's his daughter. And so, these issues are always with us.
Yeah. With regards to this idea of sort of taking the parts of the modern world you appreciate and maybe critiquing the rest, I'm wondering why. So you've read a lot of Neil Postman, but I don't see a lot of that coming through in your thoughts.
I haven't read a lot of him. I've read Amusing Ourselves to Death, but you're right. I haven't finished his book on technology. There are outliers like Postman. You see, one of the things that really caught my eye early about Peterson, when he was talking about the car and what is a car, and he was, I don't remember if it was Maps of Meaning or Personality. I think it was Maps of Meaning. He's going to the question of what is a car, and I heard that and I thought, oh, that is so right, because you can say, and in this sense, another one of your cousins, the Amish, the Amish have a point.
See, there's definitely a side of me that sometimes wants to live a Wendell Berry type existence, or sometimes I even fantasize about joining the Amish, but then I think about what their existence is actually like, and I sort of reconsider it.
No more podcasts by Welding, Welding if you're an Amish.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I could become a better reader, and I could slow down, and wouldn't have an overflow of information, and I could work with my hands. And so there's always that that sort of over, what's the word, sort of looking towards the past and seeing it probably as better than it actually was. But there's definitely a side of me that would like to live a Wendell Berry type existence.
Well, that's just it. Wendell Berry, so he's kind of Protestant Amish, but okay, so we're going to have 11 kids and 4 of them are going to die before the age of 5. How's that trade-off? You know, so when I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic working with Haitians, I remember I was giving a class or something. I just asked the class, these are all the adults from the churches, how many of you have lost a child before the age of 5? Every single couple in the room had lost a child before the age of 5. Now, if that happens in a modern family now in contemporary America, everybody's like, well, we've got to get them on. They've got to get into therapy for trauma, and how's that going to impact the other children? And I mean, it's a full court press in the world. Not very long ago, that was normal life. And so if you read someone like Bessel van der Kolk, who writes a lot about trauma, you know, one of the observations he made is that Northern Europe, just for generations, self-medicated with alcohol. I mean, why did the Irish drink so much? It was, you read Angela's Ashes sometimes, and it's like, gosh, of course they drank. Of course the Russians drank. That's all they could do to survive is drink. And so, well, why, of course, were some of our ancestors such hardcore religious people? Well, there's drinking and there's religion. And
that is the Nietzschean. I think that's from Nietzsche, isn't it? Sort of made this pointed out that sort of alcohol is sort of the what you do if you don't have religion.
That's right. Mark Maron, you can look up his podcast. He's a comedian who interviews a lot of comedians and other people. I haven't been able to find this episode yet, but I once heard him say, he was sober and he's into sobriety now and everything now. But he said, you know, Christianity is what alcoholics turn to if they just can't get sober any other way. It's like the strongest medicine. And I heard that, I thought, yeah, that's right. That's right. Because if you can't stay sober any other way and you're drinking yourself to death, well, gosh, become a Christian, because what you got to do.
It seems like comedians are often the people who sort of had it the toughest, which is sort of this weird contradiction where you have this horrible existential struggle on one hand, and then this career of comedy on the other. I think they sort of go hand in hand. Yeah,
I always noticed that growing up, that the people with the best sense of humor had the hardest lives.
Yeah, I think it's true.
So
yeah, and then there's this sort of group of people, or at least these individuals in the Hutterite tradition who are always fantasizing about the 16th century Moravia, where Hutterites are sort of fully self-sufficient, where we have this little blacksmith in the community, this brewery here, this tanner here, and we sort of and that's even attractive to me, because then you're sort of not participating in the broader capitalist system, and sort of have your own economic system within your own community. So sort of find that attractive.
Yeah. But you never ask, why did it end? You know, the CRC, when they came to North America, they had similar things. Go to Sioux Center, Iowa. Go to, you know, Bellflower, Artesia, California. Go to, you know, in some of the, when they went to some places that were far enough outside of urban areas, you know, Sioux Center, Northwest Iowa is still today kind of CRC colony space, where they've set up their own colony and they're self-sufficient and they're prosperous, but that prosperity always opens doors. And
what Neil Postman would say is every technological breakthrough has its downside. So you have a problem here and you're going to address it with more technology, and this creates more problems in it's always, you always have to wonder if you're getting if the trade-off you're making now is worth it.
Yeah. But part of the challenge is the imagination of the cocoon, in that let's say the Dutch Calvinists in early 20th century America, that was deeply tied to the rest of the world in ways that weren't intrusive but were still there. You know, why was there all this rich farmland in northwest Iowa available for hardly any money? Well, that's because of this whole long line of history that made it available, and it's Columbus, and it's, you know, it's American politics, and it's Dutch politics, and why this tiny group of secessionists became such a disproportionate amount of the settlers in North America. They were 5% of the Dutch church, and they became 75% of the immigrants. Well, they were probably also dirt poor, which is why they became the immigrants, and then they came because they didn't have to worry about the state church. But then the RCA came, and you know, and there are golden ages, but they're never as pure as we imagine they were in history.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's like we pointed out before with the Roman Catholic thing. Again, you're looking at abstract ideals and not considering the lived existence. So I'm wondering what did you think of the Benjamin Boyce Esther O'Reilly conversation? Super interesting, wasn't it?
Oh, Esther's going to watch this, of course. And I keep calling her an evangelical, and I don't think she quite likes that, you know. But, you know, and that's.
We can cut this part out, so I want your honest opinion. Or we cannot just not post the whole thing. But
it's I'll say it this way. Everyone wants to hear, or not everyone, a group of people want to hear, say, Jordan Peterson really get into it with William Lane Craig. I don't think that conversation would go well.
I think that was the same thing happening in this conversation. It was sort of two people coming at it from completely different perspectives.
That's right.
Yeah, and that was super interesting.
There's a cultural element in evangelicalism that looks for boy, Esther's going to hate me for this, but that looks for the quick win. You know, there's a market tribalism in evangelicalism that says, you know, the goal of my, you know, let's say I think, well, Hutterites, well, they love Jesus, but, you know, they've got all their ethnocentric traditions and blah, blah, blah. So what really we should do is get Julian into a church with a smoke machine and an electric guitar. That's my goal for Julian's life. And so I'm going to try and so I want to get Julian to stop welding, and I want to get him into Calvin College, and, you know, and then maybe after Calvin College, he'll get to go to we don't send people to the Free University of Amsterdam anymore, Calvin College like we used to. Now maybe he'll go to Harvard or Yale or Wheaton, and, you know.
We can engage the culture.
So there's just this element in evangelicalism that sometimes these conversations, and I get this, you know, if you read the comment section, which I know you do, you know, you'll have some in the comment section, they'll listen to me, and I remember one of my favorite comments in all of my videos was comment on a video, is Jordan Peterson a Christian? And the answer, real quick comment from one person was no, and probably you're not either, you know.
And the other day there was somebody in the comment section of this really long, interesting comment. He was talking about your analogy about Tolkien and how that sort of connects to the real world. And this guy that I commented it on this. There was this, I don't know, maybe it was an evangelical or something, but then I said something about, does this analogy show that we don't have free will because it's sort of God as Tolkien who's writing the story of all the characters? And this guy was saying, oh, Paul is using this analogy because he's a Calvinist, and the Calvinists are determinists, and which isn't a very biblical position. but yeah, to get back to the point.
But, here's the thing. You and I are both conservative Orthodox Christians. We both believe in the resurrection. We both have a high view of Scripture. But here's the thing. Both of our traditions are older than neo-evangelicalism.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the reason why we don't quite fit into the evangelical tradition as well. And part of it, too, is that the evangelical position is in this free market America that has its own epistemology of tribes and conversions. And our traditions are quite a bit less conversionistic, not in that we don't believe in rigorous Christian conversion. We just don't really think you can. I'm going to sit down with Julian and have him say the sinner's prayer. Now Esther is going to complain about what I just said and say, Paul, I'm not that simplistic. And she's right. She isn't that simplistic. But to many people in the world, that's how it looks and feels.
And to speak to that, it also, evangelicalism, I guess we're both using the term sort of broadly, and there probably isn't an evangelical who exists who fits our stereotypical view of what evangelicalism is.
Oh, I know a few.
Here we go. Here we go.
It's not Esther, but I know a few.
Well, it sort of strikes me that there's sort of these two camps. There's sort of the intellectual evangelicals, and there's sort of the be saved by Jesus type of evangelicals. And the be saved by Jesus type evangelicals have these 5 propositions that you have to, these 5 steps or these 5 propositions that if you assent to these propositions, or if you agree with these propositions, and if you complete this 5-step program, then you're saved by Jesus and you're a Christian.
Right.
And the sort of other evangelical tribe, the intellectual tribe, thinks that you can approach this individual and then give him this reasoned argument, and then he'll become a Christian. And it sort of, again, goes back to this human anthropology that sees the human being as this rational animal who wants to assert to these propositions, or who wants to, who's going to be convinced by this rational argument. And that's sort of what struck me about this O'Reilly voice conversation was, it really struck me as sort of, really reminded me of Kierkegaard concluding on scientific postscript. So sort of the question he wants to answer in his postscript is, how do I become a Christian? And if you ask the question that way, it's so radically different than the question sort of the intellectual evangelicals are asking. What they're asking is Christianity true? But Kierkegaard is sort of radically reframing it by saying, okay, I'm an individual. I want to become a Christian. How do I do it? And I think once you ask the question that way, it just changes how you approach Christianity in a really radical way.
Yeah. Well, Kierkegaard is the father of a lot of American expressive individualism in an ironic way.
I hope not.
In an ironic way.
I sort of see I don't know if you can make the connection, but it almost seems like Kierkegaard is the father of evangelicalism in a weird sort of way, because he's all about this personal relationship with Jesus.
Yeah,
but
that's true too.
I don't know if you could trace him back, because he's so many things that the typical evangelical wouldn't like.
Right. Well, and that's where all this downstream language. So Kierkegaard and existentialism. There's so much existentialism in American expressive individualism. Yeah. But also, just as you said, so these incredibly important thinkers like Kierkegaard, incredibly seminal. I mean, they seed so many often contradictory tribal elements that you'll find Kierkegaard in both sides. But I think your take on evangelicalism is really helpful. See, part of what, so
my problem, if I can interrupt, my problem is I tend to have these low resolution snapshots of different things, and it's really not very helpful if you're dealing with individuals.
But you can't live without them. You need them because the world is just too complex. And so as long as you hold them loosely and recognize, how well do I know Esther? I've had a couple of conversations with her. We go back and forth on Twitter in the comment section. I know Esther a little bit, but I fill in a lot of Esther fairly or unfairly with stereotypes that I have. Mm-hmm. I know her real name. I know where she's from. I know a little bit of her background. And so I fill in. Now, that may be totally unfair to her. Same with Benjamin. I know far less about Benjamin, but you take a few clues and you fill it in. And again, now we get into pragmatism. It's usually good enough until, as Peterson mentions with his Roger Scruton conversation, until you get something wrong. And then you say, okay, well, now I have to up the definition and correct my little hash of who these people are.
But the writer can always sort of integrate that contradiction and make it fit anyway. And one thing I admire about you is you're somehow able to approach these people and sort of still, you don't take it too seriously. Like, if I'm looking at the different ideologies that I see these people as manifesting, like I'll say, the Silicon Valley ideology is pernicious, or the fundamentalists are pernicious, or the evangelicals are pernicious, or the modernists are pernicious. Like, I don't like this worldview. It has some things I want to oppose. And so every time I come across a modernist in the comment section or in real life, or an evangelical or some other hated tribe, then I sort of want to argue with them, and you seem to be able to approach them and you just laugh at them, and I just appreciate that.
Well, I maybe that's hubris, maybe it's elitism. We're just all people.
Yeah.
We have ideas, and people change. And, again, and I think in terms of Christianity, I think what Jesus' hierarchy says is, first of all, they're people. Okay. So let's put that high. They might be evangelical. They might be a modernist. They might be an atheist. They might be a Roman Catholic. They might be an icon carver, oh my goodness, but they're people. And so, and this, I think we see, this is part of what's so attractive about Jesus, is that on one hand, we think, okay, he's going to prioritize people, so he's just going to be Zen. But Jesus isn't just Zen with people. Jesus also can be very, Jesus in the way he handles people. Look at the woman at the well. On one hand, John 4, he's so nuanced. And then, oh yeah, you don't have one husband, you've had 5. But he just says that with just the right touch. And I think when it comes to, well, what's the goal of being a Christian? Well, it's being Jesus now in the 21st century with the past and tradition that I've had. Well, how can I integrate Jesus into me and then treat people as Jesus would have me treat them? So that's the goal. And that's why, and part of it is temperament. Part of it is, I remember one person, a friend of mine who knew my father, because he was my father's pastor for a while, made the comment, he said, your father could have gotten along with Hitler. And that's probably true. And people would be horrified at that. Was my father soft on racism? Well, no one who would know my father would imagine that. But, my father had a capacity to love lots of different kinds of people. And I think that's a very godly trait.
Yes, I agree. But how do you sort of square that with, anybody can be friends with anybody, but doesn't friendship sort of also entail critiquing what you see as false views they have, or engaging them in a critical way, and sort of having love for them, and not just sort of accepting wholesale the horrible person they are, as Peterson would say, having friends who want the best for you.
Right.
So is that something you or your father would be able to integrate? Would
I hope so.
Be able to tell it or not?
It's funny because to some people I'm too critical, and to other people I'm too easygoing. So
yeah.
But that's exactly right. But always to figure out how to do that in a productive way is very, very difficult. And so you try to figure out when to speak, when to shut up. And again, part of the beauty of age, so I'm 55 now, is you make a lot of mistakes. I remember when I was going to move to the Dominican Republic, I had to learn Spanish, even though I had high school Spanish, and I didn't really learn anything, or even college Spanish. And I remember one of our coaches said, if you want to learn a language, you have to make 1 million mistakes. You might as well start now. And so when we moved to the country, my wife, who had she was a Spanish major, so she actually had a pretty good handle on Spanish. She'd listened to me talk, and she was just horrified. She's just saying, you're just butchering the language. I said, yeah, but I'm working on my 1 million mistakes. And so you do this and you get stuff wrong, but you're exactly right. On one hand, this is, and again, we don't have the great conceptual language about this, but if you want to really engage productively with someone, they're going to have to know that you love them, but you're also...
Sorry. Okay. I just jumped off for a bit. I had to get my internet back on. We have this 90-minute counter. But you were saying you were butchering the language.
Well, I was butchering the language because I was making my 1 million mistakes. Why be slow about it? So with
confidently talking to everybody, eh? Usual verbose self.
So then when it comes to people, figure out how to love them. That's the goal. At the top of our hierarchy in terms of how to treat people is love. But as you just said quite correctly, love means not simply mirroring them. So then what you figure out is how to listen well. And Peterson does this. I mean, the real reason to get a VIP ticket when Peterson comes to town is to watch him meet effectively with 160 people and give them his full undivided attention for 60 seconds.
Do you think Peterson does this well with the postmodern neo-Marxists, though?
Peterson is...
But then again, it's really hard for me to critique how Peterson engages with these people, because if I were in his situation, I don't think I'd handle it as well as he does. So something you have to keep in mind as well.
It's so hard even to evaluate success in this score, because on one hand, all of the moves that he's made has elevated him to a position where he's actually noticed and hated. And so, well, that's something, that's actually an accomplishment, because someone would say Paul VanderKlay and everyone would say who? Someone says Jordan Peterson and say, oh, he's alt-right. Well, you're wrong. He isn't alt-right. But actually he's on the radar, and so he's actually doing something. So it's in some ways always a little wrong for us to critique him, because what have we done? So, but at the same time, sometimes he makes moves and takes steps, and I think, I don't know if that's a right move. But then again, also we have the problem of time. In this moment, it doesn't look like the right move. Maybe 5 months or 5 years from now, it'll look like genius. We can't tell.
Yeah. And he can't either, I'm sure.
No. So he's making it up as he goes along, and more power to him. It's been a blessing to me.
And with your point on treating people as image bearers, essentially, one thing I've been thinking about this Christmas season is on the whole significance of the incarnation. And the whole idea that Jesus is both fully God and fully man. Kierkegaard would say he's the God man, and he's not sort of a universal archetypal man. He's a particular man, right? He's a first century Jew who hangs out with Martha and with Lazarus, and who eats fish from the Lake of Galilee, and who runs around in the water getting his feet wet, and who picks up a particular person from that particular time's child and holds it on his lap, and who goes to the Jewish temple and who speaks with Jewish individuals. And it's just all those particularities. And I think that's such a paradoxical and beautiful thing at the same time, because it's like this is the God of the universe as a particular human being, and it shows that he loves each particular human being as a particular human being, and each particular human being has to approach the God man as a particular human being. And yeah, that's something I've really picked up from Kierkegaard. He's really big on the incarnation and the absolute paradoxical nature of it, that God became this particular man, and you just can't wrap your head around it.
Yeah. And that's exactly right, because we don't even know, we can't even, we're having all this trouble conceptualizing just what does the word God mean. And then you connect it to a human being, just like you said. I think you articulated it wonderfully. We just can't get our head around it. Well, what is the best, and this I think is where your tradition has some strength. Well, what is the best way to actually bear witness to this and represent this? Is it through theological books? Well, that's good.
Right.
Not a bad thing. No, it's because when we incarnate it in our lives, that's in a way the highest representation we can have and do. And that's actually that's exactly how we will be evaluated. That's what the Bible says. We're evaluated on what we do, on how we live, on how we navigate this incredible matrix. And, now you've got that in our Protestantism. Well, we're saved by grace. Yeah, that's true. And they're both true. Well, how can they be both true? Well, we don't know.
Paradox.
Mr. Evangelical, we don't know. We're just doing it.
And see, that's another thing. If I go back to the question Kierkegaard asked about how do I become a Christian, and how that just radically reframes your entire approach to Christianity. It's no longer in an abstract, objective sort of way, is Christianity true? I mean, once I actually think this question through, I don't have to go looking all day for a new argument for God's existence, or a new reason why the resurrection happened, or a new reason why the Bible is trustworthy. Ultimately, what you need to do is make a commitment and take a leap of faith. And Kierkegaard has this wonderful quotation where he speaks of floating above 70,000 fathoms of water, where only God can reach you. And it's sort of, I may not have all the answers. There may be some paradoxes. There may be some things I can't wrap my head around. But ultimately, I sort of have to put my trust in this God man. And he also says, Kierkegaard says this little line where it says, God isn't an object to be reasoned to, he's a subject to be experienced. And it's like, if God is a person, if God became Jesus Christ, and he's available for me, and he's three persons. If he's available, like there's three of them. If he's available, well, if he's available for me to connect to, this objective approach of rationality and of objective truth isn't just the wrong approach. It's actually an approach that distracts me from my ultimate goal as a Christian, which is to become more united fully with God. And the more time I spend looking at arbitrary objective proofs of Christianity, the less time I'm spending developing myself as a Christian. And this is really something that sort of made me rethink my whole approach. I'm more interested now in sort of looking at growing as a Christian and what is the meaning of the Bible. What can it tell me about how to grow as a person and as a Christian, instead of spending my time, is this a historical fact? Oh, did this actually happen? I'm sort of more engaged in trying to grow as a Christian. And to take this back to the conversation with Boyce and Esther, it seems to me that that's what I disagree with about sort of Esther's objective approach. Is it's fundamentally a distraction from what it actually means to be a Christian.
I think that's right. I think in defense, I'll defend the neo-evangelicals now. You and I had the blessing of being raised by deeply Christian parents, deeply embedded within the Christian community and worldview. It is very easy for you and I to believe in the resurrection, to believe in God's love. That for you and I is very, very easy. And there are many, many people who were raised in a secular place for which all of these working out rational arguments and reasons. Now, Esther was also raised in a deeply Christian household. I'm not going to say that, but there are many, many people for whom working through these things is vital for them to fully integrate and appropriate what you and I, in a sense, received by inheritance.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, they have to be self-made, and you and I were born to wealth. And
I'm not exactly sure how I would respond to that with regards to how non-Christians would what non-Christians would think about Kierkegaard's approach of sort of eschewing the objective approach and sort of putting your trust radically in what's ultimately a paradox, in what's ultimately beyond reason. But I definitely think that as a Christian, there's sort of this danger of getting swept away in these objective arguments and sort of being like this spinning wheel that doesn't get anywhere. And it's almost like a form of idolatry, because you're sort of putting your trust in this fancy argument for God's existence and not wading out over 70,000 fathoms where only God can reach you.
yeah.
Which I don't claim to do myself, because it's really hard to dispense with all that lies between you and God. But
life may send you out into those fathoms. You know, and those fathoms find us in ways that we're never quite prepared for. That's the definition of them. I think there is room for a lot of diversity in God's ecosystem. And so I've known people that they simply, that, I agree with your critique. But at the same time, there's a reason Christians have done all that work. And in my experience, people do that work for reasons of their own. And some of them, I've often found it when I live in a highly secular context here in Northern California. It's extremely diverse, but the secularism can be a bit much at times, and it's often those times that I'll say, okay, I need to read through some more C.S. Lewis, and because Lewis as a guide will kind of help me look at some things and say, okay, that was kind of pressing upon me, but this, okay, I can understand that better for what it is, and understand that animal as it is and why it's functioning that way. And Lewis helped me see some of those things. So I think that the kingdom and the church is richer for Thomas Aquinas and Josh McDowell, if I dare put those two in a sentence together.
oh boy. Yeah.
So, part of the outrageous scandal of Christianity is both the glory and the humiliation of people. And I think this is part of the reason, and Calvin, I think, does this quite well. If you start reading in Calvin's Institutes, on one hand, he says, to know God, you have to know man, and to know man, you have to know God. The two are connected. Now Calvinism as a tradition has been a gateway drug to secularism and all kinds of things. Jung's father was a rather unhappy Swiss Calvinist. Calvinism is deeply tied to evangelicalism. If you look at some of the principles of neo-evangelicalism, some of them are Presbyterian, they're Southern Presbyterians, and there's a lot that goes on in these connections. So, and but the earlier conversation we had about assimilation, this in the Christian Reformed Church, the two assimilation factors are the mainline Presbyterianism or liberal Reformed camp, or the evangelicalism. And so that's the tension kind of pulling apart the Christian Reformed Church now. And I think your critique is right on evangelicalism, but at the same time, this pot that we have people, and you'd never look at Philip Yancey and say he's overly rationalist. He's got that in him, but he's also a little bit of a romanticist in terms of Philip Yancey. So, and nobody's got better evangelical credentials than a guy like Philip Yancey. I don't know if you've read any of his books, but
no, I have no idea who Philip Yancey is.
Yeah, he was popular more in the 80s and 90s, and very popular evangelical writer, but he'd be much more along the camp of people, well, not quite. Have you ever been to a family bookstore?
Family bookstore? Maybe, but I don't think so.
Have you ever watched Veggie Tales?
Yeah. Not recently, though, when I was a kid.
So the evangelicals are a weird tribe. So on one hand, you've got rationalist warriors like Esther. On the other hand, you've got, Phil Vischer, who's making vegetables come to Jesus. And you've got Thomas Kincaid making sentimental Thomas Kincaid and Precious Moments figurines. Here we're iconoclast, but boy, we love our Precious Moments figurine. Do you know what a Precious Moments figurine is?
I don't want to know.
Oh, you should Google, do an image search of Precious Moments figurine. You'll love it. And so evangelicalism has all of these different aspects in it. And so, and I think what evangelicalism actually is and North American market-based free market ecclesiology. That's what it is. And so it's highly diverse. And you look into the Black church, and the Black church has its own segment in evangelicalism, and they've been making movies and so it's this vast ecosystem. And ironically, even the Orthodox whenever churches come to North America changes them. And so in some ways, the Orthodox Church in North America has been, in a sense, reborn from the, look at, say, the connection between, what's been the interesting things going on in the Serbian Orthodox Church or in the Russian Orthodox Church. Vladimir Putin is now the guardian of Russian Orthodoxy in a certain sense. And so the Orthodox Church in the old places was different from the Orthodox Church in North America. And so in a strange way, the Orthodox Church in North America begins to get impacted by the Borg-like evangelicals. And, I don't know how that's going to play with Jonathan Pageau, but Jonathan Pageau is a former evangelical. And so his brand of orthodoxy is always, boy, I'm making all kinds of issues with all kinds of, so, but that's, and so when I listen to Jonathan, I think he's the part of the reason he can do such cool stuff now with symbolism, translating it, is because he was raised evangelical and he knows enough of that community. But so that's in Jonathan, and it'll never be gone from him. And it's both part of the gift that he brings to the conversation, but he will never be purely Orthodox like some factory worker in Serbia or Kiev or Moscow. So just like you and I are, my Dutch Calvinism is filled with things, and so is your Hutterite.
Yeah, and probably all of the four people you listed, Esther O'Reilly, Jonathan Pageau, you, me, we'd probably all have be sort of outliers in our own tradition in many ways, because the whole intellectual tradition, the whole intellectual side of evangelicalism probably has its critics in mainstream evangelicalism for sure. And I guess the reason I'm sort of so attracted to Kierkegaard, and this sort of connects with what you said about Jonathan Pageau, is that I've been really influenced by William Lane Craig in the past. So I've sort of, I've listened to
the confessions come out. The Welder's listening to William Lane Craig. He's
definitely.
Julian's not married. Esther's not married. Will the Hutterite marry the evangelical liberal warrior? We can do some matchmaking here and now.
Oh boy, you're cutting this part out too.
Nah, this is all going in, baby. It's just like the Freddie and Paul show. One take, no editing. See, and this is part of it. We are given this gift of life. Why not have some fun? Oh, Esther's gonna, she's gonna kill us. There's so much trouble with Esther. And your mother's going to say, Julian, why don't you stop listening to the podcast? Don't listen to that VanderKlay. You know
he's crazy.
Well, we should wrap this up at some point.
I could read you a passage.
Or you got the day off?
We have Sunday today. This is my Sunday shirt. So,
okay.
And these are my Sunday suspenders. So,
this is some of what the CRC has lost, because there were aspects to our subculture that were they binding? Yes. Were they endearing? Yes. Did they give identity? Yes. Were they smothering sometimes? Yes. I mean, all that was true, but it made for a rich and full life for generations. And part of you know, maybe another thing I'm attracted to Jordan Peterson about is that I think the CRC just kind of cast this off rather mindlessly, and we didn't honor our father and our mother as we should have in casting these things aside. But at the same time, they can also smother, and all of those dynamics are in life.
It's never really a simple dualism, is it?
No, it isn't. It isn't. So, any last things you wanted to get in before we call this a show? I'm going to post this, Julian. I'm going to post this. This is gold. This is gold.
How many gold?
This is gold. Esther is going to be freaking out.
And we also have our internet pastor to proceed over our marriage. So
yeah. Esther is gonna kill me.
Arranged marriage by Paul VanderKlay. Well, let's one thing we could close with. I'd like to look at comparing Kierkegaard and Peterson. One interesting thing, I got this from Craig Evans. I'm not sure what.
Yeah.
Is he an evangelical too?
Yeah, he is.
Everybody's an evangelical. Either an evangelical or a Calvinist. But yeah, he's a Kierkegaard scholar, and I emailed him some questions, and he was nice enough to get me some responses. And one interesting thing he pointed out was Kierkegaard and Peterson on myths. They have there's an interesting interplay there. Kierkegaard, I find this pretty fascinating, was actually opposed to using the category of myth to describe the biblical narratives, because he saw myths as coming from the bottom up, but not connecting from the top. So it's sort of human beings are developing their wisdom over time, but there's never this divine connection top down. And your sort of Christian synthesis of Peterson is sort of that the bottom and the top touch. And Peterson has really never said that the bottom and the top touch.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I've got enough antithesis in my Calvinism to say maybe.
yeah. And it's interesting that Kierkegaard, he wanted this top down, wanted it to come top down, but Peterson sort of sees it as developing from the human side. And could also bring C.S. Lewis in here, who wasn't opposed to myths, and he said that Christianity is the true myth. So maybe you could say something about C.S. Lewis, since
Lewis is so helpful and so articulate and so erudite. It is so easy to fall in love with Lewis, but Lewis was just a dude. And I read a really interesting biography on Joy Davidman, which really shed a lot of interesting light on Lewis, because recently a bunch of her papers came about, and Lewis was a human being, and that in some ways just this amazing saint. But the way he went about this business with Joy Davidman, there's a lot of fast and loose going on there. He basically deceived a priest to get himself married in the Anglican Church, and it's like, what's that about? And he's a human being. So I think I don't know that we can answer these questions finally, but there is because all of our systems are, one of the things I've learned through this, all of our systems are our representations, our attempt to see and to describe and to paint pictures of what we probably are incapable of fully representing. It is always beyond us. So this is where my Calvinism comes through. We are always limited. And in that sense, we are always dependent upon grace. And so that would be, we can never fully build ourselves up to God. We are inveterate Babel Tower builders, but we will never be able to do it. And I think that's central to the story, where God has to send his son because we couldn't make it without him. And I think that's key to Christianity. And I think it's exactly that point that Peterson has, and this is where Esther and I would agree, let's say, that Peterson is in a sense building his tower, but he'll
it's not going to make it up.
Not going to make it up. And
I can read you something from Kierkegaard here.
Yeah, go ahead.
That sort of speaks to that. So he was talking about this idea that you can look at the life of Christ and then look at the impact that Christ had all throughout the ages. And he calls, since he was living in the 1800s, he calls this the argument from 1800 years. So the argument sort of is, since Christ has made such a big impact over 1800 years and he's still around us, he's still influencing our society, therefore he's God. And that's essentially what Peterson is doing with his whole mythological structure. Of course, he's not adding the therefore he's God, but he's sort of saying, look at the impact that Christianity has had through the ages. There must be, well, he's not going that far, but what Kierkegaard is essentially saying is that you can't go from these 1800 years of impact to the conclusion that Christ was God. So it's sort of, yeah, I can read it. It's pretty. But to return to the proofs of history, is it not 18,000 years since Christ lived? Is not his name proclaimed and believed on throughout the whole world? Has not his doctrine, Christianity, changed the face of the world, triumphantly permeated all relationships, and in this way has not history abundantly, and more than abundantly, established who he was, namely that he was God? No, history has not established this, neither abundantly or more than abundantly. That is something which history in all eternity cannot establish. So far, however, as the first assertion is concerned, it is sure enough that his name is proclaimed in all the world. Whether it is believed on, I will not decide. It is sure enough that Christianity has changed the face of the world, triumphantly permeated all relationships, so triumphantly that all now say that they are Christians. But what does this prove? At the most, it might prove that Jesus Christ was a great man, perhaps the greatest of all, but that he was God? Nay, stop there. The conclusion shall by God's help never be drawn. So that's Kierkegaard critiquing Peterson, I think.
I think you're right. And so this is where, so I've done a lot of thinking too, in terms of, okay, where exactly is this line between belief and unbelief? We have a hash of it in a sense, but to me, the line continues to be, and again, this expresses my Calvinism, it continues to be the place where we finally open our hands and say, you must fill them, I can't grasp it. It's the place where we finally give ourselves to him and surrender to him. And Lewis says this, we're not, we're rebels who have to lay down our arms. Well, why did we take up arms in the first place? We took up arms in the first place in order to make the world according to what we believed it needed to be. And so, there's something deep, there's something deep within us that has to surrender, and you can only surrender to a living God. A God who is anti-entropy, a God who, has his way finally, and we don't. That's why he's the husband and we're the wife. That's why he's the husband and the church is his bride. That's why all of these archetypes set up as they do. And we can't build our way to, and this is the line of modernity, the line of atheism that says we're at the top of the hierarchy. We are the writers of myth, even if we is in capital W, and it has to be the great project of humanity. And at some point, no, it's something that's come down to us. We don't create the patterns, to put it in Pageauian terms.
And this takes me back to the whole idea of the monarchical vision. Where did you get that idea, actually?
I just thought it up when I was making the video.
Oh, wow. Is that like you were sure? Wow.
I was just talking about, that's how I make videos, because I get ideas when I make them. And then I've got a record of it because I've just put it on video. That's why I do this stuff.
I bet you never listen to them again.
I know. Sometimes I have to go back if I forget what I've said, but I never listen to them again.
Yeah, I can't stand listening to myself. So it actually doesn't help to send me the video to preview it, because I can't stand listening to myself.
No, this one's going up. This one's going up today, my friend. Whether the trouble is coming this week for both of us.
I'm going to take a YouTube sabbatical for the rest of the holidays. But in any case, I think this idea of monarchical vision really connects to what you just said, because I sort of see the idea of the monarchical vision tracing through the entire biblical narrative, starting in sort of with the story of Adam and Eve, where sort of as I interpret it, you have this command by God not to, sort of God has this will or this divine plan for humanity, and then Adam and Eve, acting as individuals, decide to violate this and sort of create their own path and create their own vision of what life is supposed to be like, their own. They try to create their own cosmic pattern, as Pageau would say it. And so that's phase one of the fall of humanity. And then we get into the Tower of Babel. And what I see there is sort of a communal fall, because you have people banding together and by consensus trying to build a tower up to the heavens to take the monarchical vision in the place of God. So they're trying to through consensus establish their own path, deciding what's good, what's true, what's beautiful on their own. So you have sort of the fall of the individual and the fall of the community. And I'm not sure what to make of the Old Testament narratives, because they're too complicated. I can't really fit them into this, what I'm developing here. But if I go to the New Testament, I connected with what Paul says about neither slave nor Jew, Greek nor, neither slave nor free, Greek nor Jew, all are one in Christ. So these people are sort of in the Tower of Babel. They're collectively forming their own consensus. But in Paul, you have this idea that if everyone sort of submits to Christ as Lord, we have this monarchical vision in this community developing centered around Christ. So we are united as before the fall through union with Christ. And then I connect this to, this also connects to what you said about us being the bridegroom of Christ. Not the bridegroom, the bride of Christ. So Jesus says there are two commandments. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the way I see it, it's in our current state in the age of decay, as you would say, we sort of can't connect to God with our bodies, because we're not resurrected, we're not fully perfected. So the first part is love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. So sort of connect to God and connect your will with Jesus and make him the ruler of your entire life. Then the second part is love your neighbor as yourself. And I think this is where I connect this to my own tradition, where we are sort of living communally. And if you love your neighbor as yourself, we take this all the way and say, hey, what do I do myself? I whatever, we live communally. We do all aspects of our lives together. So the idea I see developed there is the body, we connect to Christ bodily through the body of the community. So it's sort of, as a church, by loving my neighbor as yourself, I'm loving Christ as my body. And I think you have the full unity there, and to be completed in the age to come. So
that's really beautiful. That was wonderful. You should make your own videos.
I've been wanting to write a post about this forever, but I'm too lazy to get it started is the problem. So
You don't strike me as lazy, but it's really hard. And I've done a lot of blogging in my life. It's really hard. And
I think it's harder than doing videos, actually.
it is. It's much harder. Yeah. Oh, these videos are easy. Writing's much harder. I've gotten lazy since I've been making these videos. Probably a problem.
You can, you if you can get 10,000 subscribers, just what's the word for
just vomiting onto the screen. That's what I call it.
Yeah, spewing out your consciousness on the screen.
That's exactly what I'm doing. Well, and I blogged for 10 years and nobody ever read what I wrote. Not nobody, but not a lot of people. And then you do this thing on YouTube and you get all these people watching. It's like, how weird is this? But there is something about video and representation, and Peterson is also right that it's a lot easier for a lot of people to listen than to read.
Yeah, the people who listen to you are just also lazier because they don't have to go read your blog. I mean, listening to podcasts is always easier than sitting down to read a blog or read a book. So,
well, and most of the people that listen to it are, so you're welding, so you need to do something with your brain. A lot of the people who listen to me work in computers, and they need to do something with their brain. Now, my second son is an engineer, and he's a low-level engineer right now. He's just getting started. And so he spends a lot of time doing menial tasks that the higher-paid engineers don't want to do because they're boring. So he spends a lot of his day listening to things. I listen to things when I am washing the dishes, driving the car, when basically I can't read because, I need my hands and my eyes to do things, but I'm an auditory learner, so I listen to a ton of stuff that way. I don't listen to stuff when I'm at work because I'm reading.
Oh, yeah. So you still use the books behind you?
Do I still use the books behind me? Yes.
But all of your sermons seem to be centered around this YouTube video you watched last week. So.
Yeah, here's the thing. Nobody in my congregation is going to read a lot of this highfalutin stuff. And truth be told, commentaries are also products of their contexts. And so the scholars are addressing often the scholarly issues with the text, and often those don't have a lot of connection to regular people's lives. That isn't to say that these issues aren't important, but most people in the pew, if they would open up a commentary and read the kinds of issues that commentaries spend most of their time talking about, I don't care. And I've only got, in a sermon, I've got 20 to 30 minutes, and I got to do a lot. So it's not like YouTube where I can go on for 2 hours, and I go on for 5 minutes. All the welders are disappointed. So,
Well, with regards to your half hour in that, the Hutterites are probably like iconoclastic Orthodox, because our Sunday sermons are like an hour and a half or more. So yeah, hardcore iconoclast. Yeah.
But that's another way that the CRC changed. 80, 90 years ago, CRC sermons were an hour plus. You can go onto YouTube and you can find Reformed preachers that go on for over an hour.
Wow.
But those sermons are very different. And there was once here at Living Stones, I went for an hour and I nearly faced an uprising. I have masters too.
from the people in the pews.
Oh yeah, that hour stuff. No.
That's sometimes
mainliners and Roman Catholics. So okay, you talk about other traditions. Roman Catholic homilies, they might be 10 to 15 minutes. They don't often have preaching as a major part of the service. Jonathan Pageau made a very interesting comment in one of his recent videos. He said, part of the reason I went to the Orthodox is it doesn't matter if my priest is an idiot because we have the liturgy. What happened in the Reformation was Now
It's question
suddenly we
anthropology.
want our people to know things. And so there's this huge value on education. In the medieval church, a lot of the reformers looked at that and said, these people drag their sorry butts in, they do what the church tells them to do, and they drag their sorry butts out, and they're not changed. And so reformers wanted to change people's lives and give them thoughts and ideas. But this is all part of what was happening in Northern European cities and in the Holy Roman Empire and in England. And I mean, that was all connected to a world.
Well, isn't that the old stereotype about you want to change the world, you need more education? Like anytime there's this sort of problem that needs to be addressed, the solution will be, oh, we need education.
Right.
So education at the problem. It's like Neil Postman says, sort of this assumption that every problem can be solved with more data, which is essentially what this is. Rational animals who need to correct ideas.
That's right. No, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And so the West is the child of the Protestant Reformation.
Like it or not?
For worse. And for better and for worse.
Paul, you've talked too much.
My throat is dry. I've got people in the hospital to visit and calls to make and all that kind of stuff. I'm a real life pastor. I don't just play one on YouTube.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Julian. I'll post this a little bit later today when I got a better connection at home, so I can upload things easier there. This is a long one, but I thought I don't know if I'm going to have time to make any videos this week, so this will be good.
Well, I hope the people aren't offended by our little arranged marriage thing we had there. Or
they're gonna love it. Maybe someone will even make a meme.
You don't get any memes, do you?
This is gonna be fun.
Do you get any memes as a little YouTuber?
I got a meme there's a little secret Jordan Peterson Facebook group called the Advanced Study Group. It only has about 80 people in it, and so there's a big study group that has lots of people, and someone carved out a little study group with just not very many people in it. Esther's in that group. Someone made a meme of me, which was hilarious. But
email it to me.
Okay, I'll have to save it. It wasn't a humorous meme, but I always thought, oh, they made a meme of me. So
yeah,
except for Rationality Rules, who made kind of a meme of me in one of his videos too, which I thought was hysterical.
Okay, thanks for the conversation.
All right, Julian, you take care. We'll see you in the comments.
Yeah, you too.
Okay.
I should cut that. I should cut back in my commenting.
No, don't. They're fun. Take care.
Yeah, you too.
Bye-bye.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Bye.